Um, as Wayne mentioned, I'm teaching pastor of the Orchard here in Fair Oaks in the Sacramento area. And as I was just mentioning, I do teach interactively. So I really appreciate what Wayne was saying, and we will have a time of question and answer at the end of this. But if something doesn't make sense to you, or if you just have a pressing question, I am very accustomed to having questions. And so you can raise your hand and ask a question if there's something that you would like to during on the way, but we will take some time for Q&A at the end. As we were also just discussing, this is my first book that I've written, and I always assumed that I would write a book. God has used me to write in the past. But if you had told me that the first book that I would write would be on the subject of universal salvation, I would have thought you were crazy back a few years ago. How in the world did this happen? And I'm sure my story is probably very similar to some of yours. It'd be fascinating to hear the similarities here, but just share this a little, just briefly with you. Um, Someone who had been part of a church that I had pastored and moved away a few years ago shared with me that they were a Christian Universalist. And my first thought that I did not express to my friend, but my first thought was, I don't think you can be that. I don't think that works. And so this friend sent me a couple of books, and nothing against the books that this person sent, but at the time they just didn't really impress me. But this whole idea of Christian universalism that was distinctly Christian, wasn't just kind of the John Hicks, you can believe whatever you want to believe and all roads lead to heaven kind of a thing. But this a real Christian form of universalism, it was on my radar now. I was at least theologically curious about it. And so I was kind of I was now attuned to that and was watching for anything on that. And I'll share a little bit more with you guys than I did in the book, because I think a lot of you can really relate to some of this. I encountered a book called Universal Salvation, ? The Current Debate, which was edited by Robin Perry and Christopher Partridge, if I remember right. I don't know if you guys are familiar with the writings of Jerry Walls, but I've always appreciated him as a Christian philosopher. So I was intrigued when he was writing opposing this view. So I thought, oh, okay, he's going to have some really insightful stuff. Kind of like Paul was sharing earlier, there has to be some arguments against this. So I figured he'll be able to come up with some good arguments against this. And when I read his arguments against the view, I was profoundly unconvinced. And so I can't wait until I have the opportunity someday to let Jerry Walls know that I'm a universalist because of him. He just did not come up with any arguments that I thought were convincing at all. And so I realized, okay, I wasn't exegetically there. I wasn't there scripturally, but philosophically, I was finding it very hard to argue against. And so this was a series of succeeding waves where I would encounter books or articles or this type of thing. Robin Perry's book was huge. Didn't quite convince me, but it did convince me that you could be a very sincere, very biblically grounded, very theologically rich Christian universalist. You can be a thoroughly evangelical Christian and believe in this view. And then I reached the point, I think you guys could all probably relate to this, or many of you can. I'm not sure exactly where everyone is on this. Some of you may still be kind of grappling with this yourself. But I reached the point where I was trying to, especially as a pastor, I was studying this out, got to the point where not only did I feel like this was a plausible view for a Christian, that you could hold this in good conscience, I was finding it very difficult to refute scripturally. And then I got to the point, the more I studied it, the more I realized I saw a beauty and a wonder to it. I saw how this view was in such perfect harmony with the gospel of Jesus Christ, and how in many ways it flowed naturally out of a lot of the convictions that I already had, that it was like the logical conclusion to this, that it fit so well the biblical story and what God was doing. I came to the point where I couldn't see any other way of seeing it other than this. And I share in the book a story. When I was just a teenager, I was working at a place, and somebody that I was working with invited me over for dinner her and her family, and they were Jehovah's Witnesses. And I was expecting this. We had a Bible study afterwards, and they had some challenges on the deity of Jesus Christ that I hadn't encountered before. So I went home and I studied in depth. I was a very analytical kid. I studied in depth. And not only was I convinced of the deity of Jesus Christ, but I saw it everywhere in Scripture. I had that kind of experience with biblical universalism, Christian universalism. Not only was I seeing it in Scripture, but I was seeing it kind of woven through everywhere, all over the place. And so it was very intriguing. Well, as I was going through this process, I wasn't quite at the point of being convinced yet. Our church here in Puerto Rico, we were going through a replanting process, and kind of a revitalization. And so we were doing a lot of study about what does it mean to be a church? What does it mean to be church leaders? And so we were going through a weekly leadership training class, leadership training study. And we were doing, I was going through some study of church history, and we were talking about Augustine, and we talked about how that connected with Calvinism. We were talking about Calvinism a little earlier. And so there was a desire to maybe take a detour and dig more deeply into Calvinism and Arminianism. And what is this? And why do people have these different views? Well, at the end of this, and I was endeavoring not to say anything about hell, anything about universalism, anything about any of these types of things, because it was not my desire at all to bring this into the discussion. I was still going through a lot of this study myself. The last thing I wanted to do was to bring this into the discussion with the church. And at our last study on this detour into Calvinism and these things, somebody mentioned universalism. And there was a question, what is universalism? And so I briefly explained the views that evangelical Christians hold on this. Eternal conscious torment, annihilationism, evangelical universalism. And there was interest in that. And they asked, can we take another detour on this and go through these views? So we did. And at the end, they were very eager to know what my view was. And I shared with them openly that I was finding it very difficult to refute this view of universalism. That began over a period of time, a few different studies that we did first. We opened it up more to the church at some point, quite a while after that, and it became a topic of conversation. And so we ended up studying it as a church, and we all came to the conclusion, not that everybody agreed on this, but we came to a solid conclusion that this is not something that we should be dogmatic about as a church, that we should provide the freedom for anyone in the church, including our pastors and leaders, to hold any of these different viewpoints. Kind of a side discussion. Maybe if you want to, I can go into that later. That was not the view of our denomination. We were part of the Evangelical Free Church of America, which is a wonderful association, wonderful. But part of their statement of faith was eternal conscious punishment. So that was a whole interesting side story that we can talk about later. But eventually, we'd made this decision, and there were people that were asking, because I was sharing with them books that I had read, and there's someone asked, do you have a really good, easy explanation that we can read for for universal reconciliation and restoration? And so I wrote a series of blog posts, and I got a great response to that. And a lot of people encouraged me, you should turn this into a book. This would be a great resource. And so I eventually did that, and it was recently published, and that's what we're talking about. The title is Until the Last One's Found, and the subtitle is An Introduction to Universal Reconciliation and Restoration. And so the intention of this was not to duplicate. I so appreciate the work of Robin Perry, Thomas Talbot. There's so many others that have written really wonderful books that have been very helpful, and articles and YouTube videos and that type of thing. My desire was to write something that my concern was more pastoral in nature. A lot of these guys are scholars, wonderful scholars, theologians, philosophers, this type of thing. What I was intending to do is to write something that was more pastoral in nature, that would be a very logical and systematic introduction to this belief, but also one that was very, very accessible. and accessible in two different ways. One that was very accessible in the sense of being very easy to read, that someone who wasn't accustomed to reading books on theology or philosophy could pick it up and be able to read it without a whole lot of challenge, a whole lot of difficulty. But also I wanted to be very accessible to people who were not really familiar with this belief. And so I tried to approach it in such a way where I kind of showed my journey going through this, at least logically, in dealing with each of these things. And I started off basically kind of trying to start off on common ground where, whoa, this is a different kind of idea. This is kind of challenging, might even sound a little crazy. Why should we entertain this kind of belief? And so I start off with some introductory things. I'm just going to kind of give you a synopsis of how the book unfolds, and then we can talk more about any of these areas that you want to. But I start off with some introductory things, introducing myself. I explain the different words that are used in Scripture that have been translated hell, Sheol, Hades, and Gehenna, and how in definitely Sheol and Hades, but also in my opinion, Gehenna really are not referring to what we would call hell at all. And so I go through that in a chapter. And then I have a section on looking at why should we believe hell is eternal. And so I look at the view at how that would be presented, how I presented it as a pastor for many years, because I've had many occasions where people in my church or someone that I know, they were struggling with hell. And I was never a hellfire and brimstone preacher. I didn't love the idea of eternal hell, but I felt to be biblically faithful, that had to be the view I held. And so how did I present that? And it was always based on two foundational claims. One was what I felt was the unequivocal wording of Scripture. To me, it was just unavoidable. Scripture was just very clear that hell was eternal. Hell is eternal. And second was the consistent view of the church throughout church history. And those to me were the foundational claims for that. That's why I can pull up, I didn't do this, but I could show you emails that I still have interacting with people that were questioning hell where I relied on those two claims. That is how I did. And I'm not the only one. A lot of pastors and teachers have done the same thing. So then I went back and I reevaluated those two foundational claims. And so the first chapter I write in that section is on church history. And I go through and I show where actually this was not, eternal conscious torment was not the prevailing view of the church throughout the first 500 years of church history. In fact, it wasn't even the majority view. And so I go through that and I talk about some of the great heroes of the faith, Gregory of Nyssa, most likely if you're familiar with some of the church history, all of the Cappadocian fathers, most likely, Basil of Caesarea, Gregory Nazianzen. I go through that, relying a lot on the work of Ilaria Romelli. I'm sure you guys, many of you are very familiar with her. And so go through that and show how, also Origen, of course. And so I write a whole chapter on that, still intending to make it very accessible, not getting too bogged down in the history, but trying to show people that this is not at all eternal conscious torment. The traditional view today is not at all the view that was assumed at that time. And not only that, but none of the early creeds refer to eternal damnation at all. And so this did not seem to be, everybody knew that a lot of these people, especially Gregory of Nyssa, it was woven all through his writings, this view. And he was held as one of the most revered theologians of the 4th century, really of early church history. He was referred to by the Nicene Council, Second Nicene Council, as Father of Fathers. And so these were very, very solid theological leaders, stalwarts in the church. And so that calls into question one of those foundational claims. It also, because one of the things I bring out is that it is predominantly the Greek speaking and writing early church leaders who believed in universal salvation. And it was predominantly the Latin writing and thinking leaders who gravitated to eternal conscious torment. That's significant, as we all know, because the New Testament was written in Greek. How could this wording be so unequivocal as we think it is, and have early natively Greek-speaking writing leaders and teachers believe that hell was not eternal? And so that calls into question the other view. And so then I spend a whole chapter dealing with aionios, primarily the meaning of aionios. And I try to do that in a very simple, easy to understand way. And show one of the things I talk about is how in my own experience, I started encountering without looking for it. I wasn't out looking for it. All of a sudden I started encountering all of these solid people I just thought were completely trustworthy, evangelical scholars who were saying, oh, aionios doesn't actually mean eternal, which was exactly what the Christian Universalists were saying. Because I share in the book, when I first heard that, oh, this word doesn't really mean eternal, I thought, okay, they're just trying to explain it away. But then I started, Greg Beale, in his fantastic commentary on Revelation, talks about how in Revelation, it doesn't mean forever and ever, literally. F. Bruce, if you're familiar with him, very well-known New Testament scholar, and he always felt like, no, this word does not, he talks about this quite a bit in his writings, that this word does not mean eternal. It means of the age to come. Even in our book, our denomination, the Evangelical Free Church of America, has a very well-worded statement of faith. I really appreciated their statement of faith. And they wrote, very helpful, they wrote a book called Evangelical Convictions, which is the official theological exposition of the statement of faith. And in their section where they talk about eternal conscious punishment, they admit that in Matthew 25, where it talks about eternal fire and eternal punishment, that the word eternal there, aionios, does not literally mean eternal. And so all of these people that I thought were just so reliable, conservative evangelical scholars, were saying the same. And it was very difficult to find anybody saying that it did mean eternal, that it had to mean eternal. And so that took away both of my foundational claims for belief in eternal conscious punishment, eternal conscious torment. So then I spend another chapter looking at other scriptures that are used to support this. And I know many of you have encountered this. For instance, the story of Lazarus and the rich man. What about that? And so I go through a whole chapter dealing with these other scripture passages and showing where none of these scripture passages really teach eternal conscious torment. And then one final chapter in that section, I go through the theological arguments, the theological case, not so much exegetical from the wording of scripture, but more broadly theological. And arguments like, because God is infinitely glorious, it requires infinite punishment. And all of these types of things that many of you are very familiar with, and we can talk more about that. And I show where none of those really, the more you look at them, the more you examine them, they don't hold together. And so it left me, and hopefully the reader, with really no biblical or theological reason other than just pure tradition, no reason to hold to a view of eternal conscious torment. So then I begin another section of the book looking at what I refer to as universal reconciliation and restoration. And I have a chapter dealing with Old Testament passages, which as many of you are probably familiar with, and we can talk more about this, much more extensive than what someone might have thought. Then I go into New Testament passages, which I think is very, very powerful. And so I deal with that, and we can go into that. Obviously, I can't go through all of the different scripture passages. We don't have enough time to do that, which is absolutely amazing, right? The scriptural case is so rich and so comprehensive that we don't have time in a setting like this to go through all of the scripture passages. That, if someone had told me that a few years ago, that would have flabbergasted me. It's like, wait a minute, what scripture passages are you talking? So we can talk about those passages if you'd like and go through some of those. But then I deal with it. Then I have a chapter dealing with the theological arguments, the theological case for for universal reconciliation. And then I have a chapter devoted to the theological challenges to this, which as an apologist, are you all familiar with that term? Someone who defends the faith. I've enjoyed for years, even before I was in pastoral ministry, I enjoyed talking with non-Christians about the Christian faith, because really the more they challenge it, the more it opens up opportunity to share. I love it when somebody will challenge the resurrection or challenge the trustworthiness of scripture, that type of thing, because it opens up the door to share with them all the wonderful evidence for that. Well, challenges to universal reconciliation are very welcome because I don't, in my opinion, none of the challenges hold water. And it gives us an opportunity to share even more about why this is such a, it just naturally flows, excuse me, from scripture. And so I spend a chapter on that. Um, and then I give a couple of extra chapters that hopefully will be intriguing to people. One is, what about annihilationism? I don't spend a lot of time on that, but I do have one chapter that goes into that, and why that's not compelling. I don't find that compelling, that view, although I respect it and respect those who hold it. I don't personally find it compelling. And then I have a final chapter that I think some of you, judging from our conversation before we started, would appreciate this. I have a final chapter on Calvinism, Arminianism, and Universalism. And one of the things that fascinated me, some of you are probably familiar with this. There have been people over the years that have tried to find a mediating position between Calvinism and Arminianism. Some have referred to this as being Calminian or something like that. And it just doesn't work. It does not, as much as, in my opinion, and the opinion of most theologians on both sides of that discussion, that debate, it just doesn't work, because there are certain points that you kind of have to fall on one side or the other on. And in my opinion, there are weaknesses on both sides. And what was amazing to me is that universalism, a biblical universalism, universal reconciliation and restoration, really perfectly addresses all of the weaknesses on both sides, Calvinism and Arminianism. As Wayne and I were talking before many of you joined us, in many ways, universalism is the logical conclusion to Calvinist convictions, of the 5 points of Calvinism. It really, in some ways, I think, only comes together perfectly with that understanding. And so I go through that a little bit, into that a little bit in the last chapter, again, seeking to do it in a way that's very accessible, so that people who haven't, this has always been one of the most intriguing areas of theology for me. So I've read books on this for years and years and years. For people who haven't, I tried to write a chapter that could go into that and explain it in a way that, but also that would be enjoyable for people who are a part of that discussion. So that's kind of a brief description of who I am, how I encountered this whole thing, and why I wrote the way I did and the way I wrote. I think that would kind of gives us a good basis, without digging too deeply into any of these areas that, without knowing necessarily where your interests are and what you would like to discuss more. So now, Wayne, if it's okay, I think we could just open it